My network is fine. It's showing. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. I hope this session turns out to be really good because we have a very eminent speaker. Just a little bit of webinar and what it intends to do. And also the pattern, how we'll be doing it. Some of it Sharmisha has already talked about. We are having this webinar because we realize that the sector, and as you would all know, that Azim Premji University and the foundation is well known in the space of development and development sector. And as we have in the recent past, that the sector has been witnessing massive change, be the regulatory framework or the donor-recipient relationship, or even the approaches of interventions of various organizations. Now, in order to respond, we have seen is that, even though the changes are external, lots of internal changes are also to be brought about by each of these organizations, and the organizations are constantly grappling with that. Now, the changes can range from legal compliances to organization culture, or maybe changing the domain of intervention itself. Now, given this very tumultuous time, and when the sector is undergoing a change, the organization is undergoing a change, the role of a leader in the organization becomes critical, not just to manage the internal organizational matters, but also to respond appropriately to the changing environment and also decide on a direction for the. So that's the larger context of this webinar. And some of these points will be taken up and discussed by our speakers during our discussion. Now, the webinar, as we have planned, is that we have speakers and I'll be moderating. So I'll have a few questions for them. But before we get there, a little bit of a background about Professor Ashok Sarkar and Professor Manikandan. Many of you, I can see some of you are already familiar with them. There are students or as collaborators. So Professor Ashok Sarkar has had 3 decades or more than 3 decades of experience in the sector, ranging from program design to monitoring, to even policy advocacy on the issues of land rights, and livelihood. His deep engagement with the sector and a very rich experience, I'm sure will help us understand the sector even better. Currently, he's leading the Center for Professor Manikandan has had more than 16 years of experience in the sector, particularly in NGO governance, grant management, fundraising, etc. But his experience is quite rich. In fact, he's led Timbuktu Collective for over a decade in its operations. So we would probably get to learn more about the organizational commitments or the changes, the responses to changing nature of the sector. Currently, Professor Manikandan is a faculty member at the School of Development, and he's also leading the field practice team in our school. So with both of their experiences and background, I would be posing certain questions to each one of them, to which both of them will respond. Professor Ashok, this is a question. The first question is for you. So I have been talking about changes in the sector and how the sector has, even not just recently, but over several years have undergone massive change. So I would like changes, according to you, that the sector has witnessed in the period of time in recent past, especially with respect to access to funding, or maybe the domains of intervention. So what, according to you, or how, according to you, the sector has been changing and responding to these kind of challenges?
Thanks, Pooja, for inviting me to talk about this. So let me start by saying that if you take a longer view of the sector, let's say from the 70s or the 80s, then one can see multiple changes happened in terms of access to funding or even emphasis on thematic areas. There was a time, let's say in the 80s, even in the parts of the 90s, where the donors used to associate with the organizations the NGOs or the civil society organizations for generally a long period, 10 years, 15 years, and even sometimes even more. I mean, I can remember donors like, let's say, Save the Children, donors like Oxfam, or even ActionAid and many others have engaged with organizations for a longer time, working with them in multiple dimensions. For example, building capacity of the organization, sometimes even assets of the organization, working in multiple thematic areas. The approach was, in a way, much more organic, holistic, and somewhat of a close interaction between the donors and the organizations. Then, of course, the donors started to modify that sort of a approach from the later in the late 90s and even the early 2000s, when two things happened. One, of course, we should remember, some of the audience, I'm sure, will remember the nuclear bomb, not the bomb, the nuclear facility that was inaugurated, and India became nuclear power in 1998 and thereafter. And the general reaction that has happened in the Western world about why should we support India. And also India reacted to that sort of a response by saying we don't need support from many countries. And therefore, many small European countries and others have withdrawn from India. And India actually said that we will only have fundings from 6 countries, including, of course, the England, Great Britain, US, Canada, and a couple more. And the others actually withdrew and had that was one big event that started happening. Also, nearly the same time, the sector seen a change in the approach of the donor and the way the donors associate with the organizations. One, it was about the more specificities that started coming in. Many of the donors started saying that we will work in certain geographies of the country. We will not work in everywhere in the country. I remember that as well. And many of the donors also started saying that we will work in selected thematic areas. Gone were the days that when the donors used to work with the organizations, and whatever was the need in the area, they used to support the organizations. Of course, that was the period, 70s, 80s, where even the organizations worked more or less in a large, in an embedded way in the communities, and therefore you must have seen many large organizations started coming up in the field, where they had a large presence on the field, working in multiple thematic areas, have a big asset in terms of their buildings and vehicles, and in remote areas, even launches and boats and all sorts of things. Bangladesh was, in fact, a classic example of that sort of an approach to the organizations. So in 2000s, two big things happened. One was this withdrawal of many of the donors, and the other was more specificity started coming in terms of geographies as well as in thematic areas. Then, of course, there was another time, another period, which was not so long ago, when even government realized that they should take support from the civil society organizations in multiple programs. Of course, SGSY, the prelude to the NRLM, was one such program. The NABARD started working with the self-help groups, and there were many such supports that started coming from the government. And in fact, government became an important player and an important donor in the sector through multiple missions, through multiple schemes, multiple programs, where civil society organizations became a partner to the government departments, whether it was watersheds, whether it was on health, whether it was on some livelihoods issues, women in development, many other things for that matter. At the same time, the donor community's approach also started changing. The donor communities realized that the sector has to become more professional. It's difficult to point out which particular point in time it started happening, but it surely started happening sometimes in the mid-2000s. And therefore, a large chunk of professionalized cadre started coming in from the colleges, from the schools, from the universities and from the management institutes. TISs became very popular. In the 1980s, then of course, IRMA became very popular. And thereafter, there were many such social work colleges which produced professionals that entered the sector. And that flow is still increasing a lot. But at the same time, there was another change that started happening, which is that the work that was focused from the civil society, mostly directly with the communities, also had now started happening at multiple other levels. One is, of course, in terms of advocacy at the state and the national level. A certain think tank type organizations started coming in, which was supported from the donors. The donors also started working in many other dimensions of civil society. Even, for example, I remember Ford Foundation supporting some
क्या
of the
कहना वो ओपन करना है उधर से
accountability initiatives, some other initiatives of democracy, etc. So the horizon started expanding for the civil society. The layers of work that civil society used to engage started expanding. The types of organizations that emerged in the 2000s are also also undergone changes. There were more professional organizations, there were more activist small groups that started emerging. There are the older type, very large embedded community-centric civil society organizations that has happened. And then the last phase that we are, the latest phase that we are in, I think is what has happened. I would describe it in 2-3 ways. One is a very direct or very, I would say, concerted effort towards professionalization of the sector. I'm not making a judgment comment here. I'm just saying this is what has been happening. And professionalization actually entails multiple things. One is, of course, the way the organization is or the institution is organized itself, the type of people that work, the processes and procedures within the organization, the systems and processes the organizations have to follow. The sector became much more metric driven. Indicators and log frames and many other things started coming in. And I'm giving a broad brush picture. So some things that happened for some organizations maybe 20 years ago, some things have happened for another organization. The same thing may have happened just 10 years ago. But these are certainly that is happening. And then the newer entry, or rather the newest entry into the sector is this what is called corporate social responsibility, which is again in just the last decade. So the decade that suddenly had an act of the Companies Act got modified and altered to provide the scope for the corporate sector to contribute to social development, national development, broadly speaking. And therefore, the CSR and CSR or type organizations became a reality in the sector itself. That even had started changing. But even later, another sort of things that started changing is what we can call social enterprises. Even for-profit organizations in the social sector, there are multiple for-profit organizations in the education sector, for example. Even in livelihood sector, there are for-profit organizations now working, as well as entrepreneurial organizations or enterprise organizations, which actually originally emanated probably from Bangladesh, but also now started coming into India. And the direction, of course, is towards more professionalization, more metrics. But the association between the donors and between the organizations have also become short-lived. You will now see most donors are focusing on 3 to 5 years projects. Gone back are the days where that long association was the reality. Now the association also became somewhat distant. The donors actually look at the funding. They do more of grant management rather than working together shoulder to shoulder in the sectoral development. And the relationship has become much more professional. You submit reports very regularly, etc. You provide metric. Your proposals have become very technical. Your reports are becoming very technical. So broadly speaking, the sector has undergone massive changes in last, let's say, 40 years. And the more that we see, on the one side, a part of the sector has become too professionalized, but also the other part of the sector has become, let's say, is moving towards more activism of various kinds, whether it is on environment, whether it is on rights, entitlements, welfare, whether it is on even identity issues and many other issues. So that's another direction that is happening. Now, there are also organizations in civil society that are coming up, which right from the beginning almost decide that we will have to work without the influence of the professional donors. And we can see how we can do crowdfunding, for example, has become an important mechanism in civil society, which was almost absent, even 10 years ago, 5-7 years ago. So now many people are trying to work on crowdfunding. And then also people are trying to adjust on the one hand towards how to work with the governments in implementation of the schemes and the programs of the government, or also how to work with the very professionalized donors, including the CSR donors, in which their requirements are very different. So I can keep on talking more, but I thought that sort of a broad brush, brief introduction would help. Pooja.
Yes, thanks, Shabda. I think this you have rounded up quite well. The changes not just in the sector, as a whole, but how the work nature has been changing, how the funding organizations or the sources have been changing, and also the types of organization, which is a very important thing. And that has also led to something called professionalism. And I can see the irony, while on one hand, professionalism is bringing in certain kind of structure, which is important because you have different kinds of organization in the sector now. However, it's also restricting the fluidity. So I think in this context, it would be nice if we can have Mani's view. When we talk about these changes in regulations, regulatory authorities, we think of certain kind of structural changes in the legal compliances in the organization as well. So, and we hear often them struggling with the challenges that they face. So from your experience, can you tell us something about the challenges that they face, and also the changing nature of this legal compliance, thanks to the professionalism that we have now?
Yeah. I think more than the professionalism, also, if you look at the approach that state is actually coming up with towards the civil society. One major change, we are all now quite familiar with the recent amendments from 2010 onwards, 2010 onwards, that the FCRA has been amended twice at least, in 2010 and 2020 now, the second amendment has happened. Also, the ones related to income tax, there are like a lot of changes in the last 3 years, like 2020, 2021 and all. Many changes related to the 12A, A2G related registration process, renewal process, all that. But if you see the major trend, it is like from one-time registration for functioning as a non-profit entity that has kind of moved to a kind of a renewal process, wherein every 5 years now you need to get back to the government or the state and then prove that you have existed for last 5 years, carried out non-profit activities, and then seek for another 5 years term kind of a thing. This is a major change. That's not how we started. Like in early 90s, if you thought of such things, you just one-time registration and then you are actually allowed to work for life kind of a thing. That has completely changed, which is actually quite okay that way. Like if you need to go for a renewal once in 5 years and all, if it is just looked at in a look at them separately from each other, but that's not how the state is actually looking at it. I don't know how many of us even noticed in 2019 when there was a slight amendment to the Finance Act of 2014, and then what did they amend? They just added some additional powers to the income tax department to cancel your non-profit status, not for non-compliance that is related to income tax, but even if there are any non-compliances related to any other acts that is governing you, which means it could be even your EPF is not in place properly, or your gratuity fund is not properly maintained. all other labor laws that may actually govern you, or it could be your FCRA. So any non-compliance related to any other act can also be one of the reason for cancelling your non-profit status by income tax. This is a this is an issue in that way, like because now we need to be very careful. We can't just say that okay, we lost our FCRA, but we will manage it with our domestic funds, because income tax can come back at any point and then say that no, you lost your FCRA, because of that violation we are also cancelling your non-profit. That's one major change I see in the way state is actually approaching the compliance regime. And since there are so many changes, and we are not really completely aware of many things as well, because our auditors suddenly become quite incompetent to keep up with what is actually happening. And most of the time for auditors, NGOs become the last priority, because they all know, if you even the auditing, when they finish, they are trying to finish all the companies and private limited companies first, because that's where they are actually properly paid. And then by the time our thing comes, they're just going through it much faster kind of a thing. And that's why they are not really up to date with the requirement that the civil society and the NGO sector actually has to compliance. And most of these things we are actually learning from our own networking with other organizations, and then other which are actually helping us out kind of a thing. So recently I was reading, like in last week of April, there was a notice from again from Income Tax Department, Central Board of Direct Taxes, which were actually saying that we all had to apply for renewal of this non-profit status 12A and 80G in 2021. And many of us actually applied it in a wrong way, it seems. And they are now saying that, okay, you all applied it in wrong way, now you still have time to apply and all. But when this whole provision was actually brought in, there was not enough education for the organization involved, even to how to even do it. Auditors were also clueless. That slowly becomes an issue. And then since they also brought this 2019 amendment saying that any non-compliance of any other act can lead to losing your non-profit status, makes it a bit difficult to actually function within with a lot of restriction kind of thing. So when you really ask this why question, why are they bringing in all these restrictions and all, I think that can just spiral us down, because we may get into all sorts of explanations and conspiracy theories saying that, okay, they're bringing in this restriction for so and so reasons, because those who critique license Raj is actually turning it around and then making the civil society operation licensed so much kind of a thing. All that can actually, explanations can happen, but I think that will only bring us down further. I think what we need to ask is that always the question should be, what now? Okay, so now this is the situation. This is what the changes that has been brought in. How do we basically deal with it? Because since all our effort has been to build alternatives anyway to the mainstream model of development. And here also, I think it becomes suddenly our responsibility to function within this legal structure, but still be able to keep up the work that we do. And that makes it very important and very necessary that we are aware of all these complaints regime that is there. One, either we ourselves know about it, learn about it, and then make ourselves adequately aware as leaders of our organization. If not, at least we know that, okay, we are recruiting adequate personnel who are able to deal with this. Expecting a third party like an auditor to help us in these kind of matters may not really solve the current issue. That's also my learning from the other side of working with development sector organizations. So second thing is what has helped in this thing is a whole lot of networking, because somebody in some organization has figured it out on how to do it, and then they have some new knowledge. And then being connected to a whole lot of organizations and learning from each other, I think is very important at this moment where so many restrictions are actually brought in. Yeah. I just wanted to add one more thing. I did not add the taxation part to it, because many of us, we are also promoting for-profit entities. We are promoting FPC or a farmer producer organization or some other social enterprises. to engage with the market, because as a non-profit, we are quite successful in dealing with the state and the society. But for dealing with the market from a position of strength, we are required to form for-profit organizations. And that bring in another layer of complexities, especially with after the new GST regulations were brought in. Many of us who actually formed for-profit organizations of community faced a lot of difficulty in even understanding the GST regime itself, and then to comply with it, because suddenly from an annual complaints, we are actually looking at a monthly complaints in GST regime. And that again needed a lot more training ourselves to learn what is it actually, and then to basically cope up with the situation. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Mani. I think you've highlighted the difficulties and the real challenges that some of the organizations are facing. So I would like to shift gears a little bit here. So, I mean, a lot can we talk about, not just the sector, but also the internal, compliances that are required. But from here, where I would like to take this discussion is that in this entire changing context of the sector and the organization's response, what is the role of a leader? Right? How do we understand the leadership in these organizations, especially given the current times when there is both external and internal uncertainties in some way? So here I would like to again invite Ashok Da to comment upon, how does he see the role of leader also evolving in this sector in the organization, and what are a few things, because I know you also have a lot of experience with leadership succession planning. So some of your thoughts on how should an organization take that forward? So role of a leader, and also, how can leadership succession happen, keeping what things in mind, which will take into account the changing environment. Yes, Ashok, if you can just talk about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very relevant and important question, but it also probably has to start with the idea that civil society organizations have to now look more carefully and more deeply in the organization itself. What I'm saying in this case is the sector and the organizations are more known much for their work with the communities, their work on innovations, their work on innovative models, either on livelihood or on health or on sustainability, water, gender equality, many different models that have been known. So the sector's strength is generally known as the contribution they have done in national development, social development, human development. On the other hand, the sector has not really paid adequate attention to the organization itself, and that became now very crucial for multiple reasons. One is that as Mani has been saying, that the compliance regime from the government and even from the donor sector, the due diligence and everything, that has become stricter and stricter. And so the organization has to prepare for that sort of a regime in which the organization will work. The other that will also happen is that the sector's emphasis, and even the emphasis of the government, the donors, the larger ecosystem shifts. In earlier days, it used to shift in, let's say, 15 years, once in 15 years, once in 10 years, or even 20 years sometimes. Nowadays, these shifts do happen very fast, sometimes even in 5 years, sometimes even less than that. So the shift that is taking place in the ecosystem, either in the nature of the communities, their aspirations, the other penetrations that has happened from, let's say, telecom, internet, education, access to roads, travel, mobility. So this external situation is actually moving and shifting in various directions very fast. That's another reason for which the organizations have to be attentive. Another important reason is that overall India as a country is not a priority country for the international donors anymore. The international donors have shifted their priority to Eastern Europe and some parts in Africa. So that is a reality that we have to live with. What has replaced it is some sort of few Indian donors. The rise is not very fast, but also some CSR organizations, a lot of them, and their way of thinking, even not about working, I'm saying, the way they think is very different than what the organization's way of thinking are. And on the other hand, government as well. So that's another big change that is happening. Therefore, what I'm trying to say that the organization has become an important and a crucial entity, not only the work that they do, but the organization itself in terms of its processes, systems, structures, procedures, in terms of its ability to sustain these sort of changes in the ecosystem, in terms of ability to respond to these sort of challenges, has become very crucial. Therefore, the attention has to be much more on the organization itself. And then we have to place the role of the leader or the leadership. When I mean is leader is not a person, I'm talking of a leadership role here. That becomes very crucial about how to prepare the organization to be able to still work in a vibrant manner, still sustain its own essential mission, doesn't drift the mission from its essential essence, still be relevant and in the sector, and also do contribute to the social sector as it was and it has been doing so far. So the role of the leader then becomes not only a role of a manager, it is much more than a role of a manager. A manager's role is essentially to execute systematically in a well-planned manner, in a time-bound manner, in a manner in which you actually achieve your outputs and outcomes, given the cost and given the expenses that you have, given the funds that you have. But a leader and the leadership role becomes much more important in this context, much beyond the manager. The leader has to think about understanding the changing ecosystem very much, understanding how to prepare the organizations and what is required to have the organization retain talent, retain important people. Third thing is to develop second line leadership and the third line leadership, and have a mechanism in which leadership development becomes part and parcel of the process in the organization, to develop systems and procedures in the organizations in a manner which will not remain dependent on the founder or the absolute senior leadership or the founders in some cases. Beyond the founders, we have to think about sustainability of the organization. One of the big challenges the organizations face in the sector is that many organizations have remained founder-driven for a very long time, and there is a time when the founder will become less active, less useful, and in fact, sometimes even the founder may not be there anymore for some reason, particularly of health or many others. Then how do the organization survive? So the internal working of the organization has become very, very, very important. In that context, the role of the leadership then becomes understanding the ecosystem very much, understanding the systems and processes very much, understanding what sort of development approaches are coming. Let me just take one step back here. If you look at development approaches from an organization's lens, you will see that the development approaches have shifted almost every 10 years or even less than 10 years. There was a time in just about 10 years ago, we used to hear everything has to be done through SHGs, self-help groups. Now we no longer hear SHGs, that's gone. The development approach has become almost like you have to do everything through producer companies or producer collectives. There was a time when there was a lot of emphasis on cooperatives. There was a time then there was a lot of emphasis on community organizations, village level organizations, including men and women, children, adolescents, both. So approaches or mechanisms of work are changing. Emphasis is changing. For example, much of the livelihood related work in civil society organizations have focused on the production side. And very rightly, because the production has to improve in order to generate more income. But now it is very important everybody realizes that even if you have better production through better management system of the crops, you still have to work with the market. And market is an entity which the civil society has not been very familiar with. So there are many ways the new leader has to be mindful of these different changes in approach, changes in the ecosystem, changes in the policies, and the donor emphasis, changes in the direction the compliance system regime is actually moving towards. And therefore, the role of the leadership has become not just to be an excellent a management unit. It is much more than that. It is management unit becomes a derivative of what the leadership role would become of all these things. I just want to say one more line, which is that often what we find is that the organizations which have been doing excellent work for a variety of reasons and also been doing good work on the ground, because of the changes in ecosystem, because of the changes in policies, because of the changes in the way they have been working, and it's no longer very fashionable, they lose their esteem. They lose their steam. They lose their focus, and they're not able to adapt to the new situation. One of the new things, for example, that is now getting important for organizations to look at how the same organizations can work in multiple different modes. A part of the organization can work in somewhat of an activism mode. The part of the organization can move more towards a market-driven mode. Another part can work in a very charitable mode. So there's a new way of thinking that is required in the organizational thinking process, which to our experience in India in particular and globally, the shortcoming is that the civil society has been always looked at for their fantastic work and contribution. And therefore, the organization has remained always at the background. And now it is very important that the organization also becomes very crucial, and much more emphasis needs to be put onto that. Pooja.
Absolutely. I think what you said, it's very important. That is, the role of leader is not about his or her managerial skills or leadership skills, rather how they are embedded both in the organization as well as in the sector. And maybe probably that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of challenges in succession planning as well, and why maybe some of the organizations are still in a phase where they don't really have a second line of succession. And also the irony is what you rightly said. So we really see there's a crisis related to leadership in the organization. However, at the same time, you want these leaders to understand the dynamic nature, like what Mani was talking about, the constantly changing nature of the sector. So here what we see is also emergence of these very young leaders. And I would like to, Mani, if you can just highlight, because I know you have also experienced that in your earlier organizations, that we are no longer talking about leaders who have spent 30, 40 years in the sector, right? We're talking about as young as 5 years, 6 years into the sector, and entrusted upon leadership roles or challenges. So how do you see their role? Is that the way forward? As what Ashok was saying, there is a challenge, and which then they have to respond to these changing times fast. So could these young leaders be the way forward? Can you please tell us?
I strongly think they are the way forward, and then also see a lot of requirement to invest more and more in them to make them ready to basically take up higher responsibilities. If you really look at many of the organizations that are there for say 20 years or 30 years kind of a thing, most of them are started by these really visionaries who had long-term dreams, and then they jumped into this, and they were completely different breed. They're not like many of us actually. If you really look at the way they function, right? Because they were positively responding to a particular social issue, and then they were just there. And then also it's quite understandable with the resource scarce kind of an environment with which they worked. And most of them ended up doing many of the things by themselves. So we have seen people, founders, who actually would be doing the donor engagement on one side, looking at the legal complaints this side, and also taking care of all the project implementation kind of a thing in many of the grassroots organizations. But in this whole thing, I think they also missed to groom a second line. And that may not be even a conscious thing which they've done, but that's how it has happened. But also, on the other hand, in the last 1.5 decade or so, we also see a lot of new blood in the development sector, like Ashok was already talking about, and many of them are professionally groomed in institutions like this or even APU or many other institutions. And they are there. Many of them are actually absorbed into handling a specific program management kind of roles, and they really excel in that. And when this whole thing happens, when this now the founding members of the organization, those visionaries, when they want to actually move out, and there is a strong group of project managers that are present who are professionally groomed, ready there in the organization to actually take up and then go forward with the organization. And they are the future, and they should be given the chance to do so. Only thing I see that most of them remained focused internally of organization matters and also program related, management related stuff. That's what they have actually focused more and more on, and then gained experience. They have, I think, missed out on networking outside, looking at the external context, changing external environment to which the organization is actually positively responding. Such things, I think, they missed out because of, I think, the kind of work requirement and then also the demand that is there for their day-to-day work. If only we can actually support them, this particular second line, which is, though they are not groomed as a second line, in one, enhancing their development perspectives in any way that is possible, and also to build their capacities, one in organizational dynamics, that is actually much, because you don't really learn that in your work. So if their capacity is built in organizational dynamics, finance and legal complaints related matters and all, I think they will be really excelling in their roles. And that's where we need to basically invest on. And I don't see any other options for us, because otherwise what is going to happen? All these 30 years of work, really strong with such large community present, we can't just let that fall all of a sudden, because okay, the founder is not there anymore to actively contribute. In such cases, organization should go on. In say a private limited company, this is kind of inbuilt, and I think we have figured out how to do that in such environment. In our civil society sector, I think there is a great need to build that as a common practice. Till then, I think there is a requirement to plug in and then build their capacity and hence their development perspectives. Yeah.
Right. So thanks, which means we have some hope. So that brings us to the end of this session. I mean, these are the few things that we thought. I know we can go on this for a much longer period, but then given the paucity of time, these are the few things that we wanted to discuss. So what, I mean, from the overall changing nature of the sector to how the organizations have been responding to it, the challenges that they're constantly facing, and what is it that they can do to survive in such a changing environment. And then looking at the role of a leader beyond leadership abilities, rather having an understanding of the sector and connecting organization with the work. And also, Mani, I think you made a very interesting point about visionary versus somebody who's working for an organization. And I think we have started getting some questions. I'll be taking the questions very soon. So yeah, I mean, we know that there are challenges, things are changing. Now through this webinar, we just wanted to highlight those and also to give some context, some structure to it. I would like to take 1 minute here just to say that, many of these things, in fact, Mani, whatever he discussed, I saw some comments that can be By the way, Mani, the question was if you can say all those things in Hindi also, which I'm not sure whether we'll have the time for that. But I think these are very important issues for any organization working in the sector. So just a quick thing that we have this program, a diploma program on development leadership, which again, as Ashok Das said, it's not about developing leadership skills, rather developing leadership in the development space. So whoever is interested can please get in touch with Sharmishta here or look at the website. But with that, I'll open it up with some questions. And I see the first question, in fact, came right when Mani was talking about the young leaders. And he was talking about, how different kind of expectations are being made from these leaders. So what Neeru is asking is that, is that what is leading to this kind of entrepreneurial mindset? Are we moving towards social enterprise? Is that what it means? When we are saying young leaders, and when we are saying that they are not visionaries, but they are also doing something. So any thought on that, Mani?
Yeah, I would not say entrepreneurial mindset, but a managerial mindset. I think that's how many of us, even including myself, we were trained when we were trained to get into this particular sector, which is completely different from a long-term visioning kind of a process, which we are not really trained at education institutes at that level. I think which I think most of us normally pick it up when we start working with the organization for a longer time. So there is a difference between entrepreneurial and managerial kind of a mindset. I would put more it on the managerial side. That's where our training also is.
Yeah, maybe I can add one line to this is that there have been a lot of emphasis from the 80s itself on management of organizations in the social sector, whether it is cooperatives, whether it is of other organizations. And you will see that has been responded to from the educational institutions having courses on rural management. And there are multiple such programs in multiple such institutions. We don't need to name them, but there are multiple. That is, of course, a need. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But what has become more important in the scenario, in the current scenario, is that to think of leadership beyond simply being a fantastic manager of an organization or a fantastic managerial role in an organization, rather than thinking about how we can make the organization vibrant, relevant, adaptive, learning, and still progressing, doing the work that we want to do in the continuously changing context externally and sometimes even internally. That is what is the new challenge that has emerged. We are not in a very stable period of history where things will remain more or less stable like in the 50s and 60s. We're in a very, very fast changing world now. And therefore, the organization's ability to learn, adapt, as well as being relevant and vibrant, and being able to think newly, think differently, and understand the overall ecosystem better, policies better, larger contexts better, political contexts better. That has become the new role for the leadership. Managerial role will still remain, and somebody will do that, we know. Yeah.
I think, Ashok, you just addressed this question by Jo, where she also had this concern that when we're talking about visionaries versus young leaders, right, are we bringing in too much of professionalism, too much of, business culture, where she's saying it's overtly focused on M&E and their managerial styles could be top heavy. I think that should respond to that question, what you just said, Ashok, that while that is important, but having an overall understanding of the sector and responding to the sector is something which makes the sector different from corporate leadership. So, there's a hand raised by Sachin. We can take that, and then I'm going through the questions. Yeah, Sachin.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have a question about, so there is a transition between the development sector also. So when we somebody trying to criticize government policies or something, and which is not connecting to our organization's vision or maybe mission. So that time, how should we tackle this issue with the government, especially when we want to work in these contemporary times?
I think related to this, there are also questions by Deban Dotto, where he also has this concern and question about different structures and overall philosophy and approach of government's influence on social sector. And I saw there was another question related to how to respond to government compliances.
So let me take a step back to make something clear. One is that until the late, let's say 2000s, or even let's say early 2000s, the government of India in particular, as well as many state governments, in fact, most state governments, didn't have a very composite, well-formed view of the civil society itself. They had a view that some help is needed sometimes, sometimes something is needed for which we can take and help, but there was not a clear composite view. But later on, a composite view developed where it was found that as the market and the civil society will have to play a much more important role than the state itself in social development and also human development and other developments as well, their social civil society has to be taken seriously. That was another period when there has been many such collaborations that still happen, that has been happening. And it still happens at the state government levels in multiple state governments that we can see. At the same time, there is always some changes happen in the government in which we don't have much control. But the certain policies become actually, in a way, put upon us, and then we have to face such scenarios where government policies may actually try to restrict the space for civil society or try to direct the civil society organizations to work with the government more as a junior partner or even as a very junior partner rather than becoming an important partner in itself. And that has been the later sort of a recent development where either there is a restriction that has been happening from the government on the civil society, or the civil society is being directed to support the government's work. For example, this lot of work happens now where civil society organizations are involved in aspirational districts, right? But aspirational districts is a government's idea and they want to see this happening. The important thing for any organization to think is fundamentally how autonomous or how independent we would like to be as an organization, one, and also as a sector, two, which will remain autonomous and remain as an autonomous entity, which can work with the government, with the market, with the communities, with other groups, peers, but that autonomy is fundamental to the civil society itself. For the sector and the sectoral leadership that we emphasize, that's a core question to be dealt with. And that autonomy has to be part and parcel of the organizational thinking, because otherwise the organization eventually can become only to use a very bad word, a social contractor, rather than an infrastructure contractor, right? So that risk is there, and one can fall into that trap. So therefore, that question remains the question of what we call in universities, we call autonomy, that or the freedom. That is very fundamental. And a choice has to be made about how we remain autonomous and free, but at the same time, we are able to work with multiple, stakeholders, including the government. I would say, put it this way. I mean, there have been organizations who have done it carefully, who have worked it through. They have taken up government work selectively, not all types of work. I have been part of such organizations in the past where we have had a very good relationship with the government. But even when we used to hear that please do this, please do that, we would say politely, no, we will not do this. That's not our work. So that is very important to say, that's important to remember. Yeah, Pooja.
Right. So there are some interesting questions. So one is to do with, how do you, I think Nirupama, she's asked whether there could be some groups which can be formed to negotiate with the government regarding the compliances, is that a possibility? And the other question is, on the other hand, somebody else, Anamika asking that can there be some kind of negotiations or interactions with the donors for them to collectively, come together and understand these systemic changes and funding dynamics? So I think as an organization, you're dealing with both. So any response to those two different kinds of questions, but I think addressing the same issue.
Yeah. See, there are many networks which are formed national level and state level and negotiating with the government throughout. Like I remember even when, for example, the FCRA 2010 amendments happened. See, they came in with some 10 different restrictions, and then we kind of pushed back, and then only 5 remained in the final amendment. It is, and so those bodies are there existing, including bodies like WANI, Voluntary Association Network of India, and they have been negotiating the space with the government. So they are there. So maybe we may need to strengthen them, or we all may need to join more and more in such networks and become part of the groups. That's one. To negotiate with a donor environment. See, if you really look at it, what for foreign donors, it's not really, there is no environment as such. There are individual donors, but they deal with large numbers of organizations, and then many of them actually have consultative meetings every 5 years to decide upon their funding strategy, and they're open to listening to us. Actually, it's the Indian CSR which is not really listening to us adequately, if you really look at that way, because it's about 18,000 crores FC funds last year, same 18,000 crores in CSR funds, which has come in. But CSR donors are not really ready to listen to what we actually want to say. Instead of that, they are first of all, they are restricted with the 13 items that are there in the CSR mandate of the Companies Act. Apart from that, I think there is a requirement to negotiate with Indian donors and then come on a common table, sit with them and then discuss this. It's a requirement. Somebody needs to basically initiate this to bring all these parties to a single table. Yeah.
Thanks, Mani. I think I see some comments here, and before going to Dipankar, yes, so there's a question from Anil. Good to have you here, Anil. He's one of our alumni. So some of these questions, like what Anil asked about the founders and founder-driven, some of these questions are actually addressed in our course. So we have a full-fledged course on that. So I don't think we'll have the time to address all those. But maybe we can take the question from Dipankar, because he's been raising his hand and maybe after that we can close because it's already 6. Yeah, so Dipankar.
Quickly, 2 questions. One is with the change in funding, which you are talking about, and more CSR funding, maybe less of foreign funding, and the more professionals coming in, do you see a significant change in the work which the development sector is doing? What I mean to say is that will they take easy work, accessible work, low risk work compared to going deeper into the hinterland and taking more complex issues, because they will try to avoid probably compliance issues or something like that. Do you see that risk? Second is more of a suggestion, and I don't know whether it is happening in this sector, is with the compliance requirement going higher, one model the development sector may adopt, and they may have already adopted, is to start outsourcing some of these compliance requirements rather than trying to do it themselves, or maybe creating an organization which can do it for a large number of organizations, so that not everybody has to understand, how to comply with the law, or how to do registration, or how to file, because that is going to be very difficult for smaller organizations. Over a period, they might even close down because of this. So these are my 2 areas of questions.
Yeah, so let me just say a couple of things, and Mani will have something to say on the second part, I guess. Uh, the there is always the risk that part of the social sector will drift towards easier work that can be done with a lot of that doesn't require much risk, etc. That has happened in the past, and that is happening even now, not only about CSR, also in working with governments and working with schemes, government schemes. That has happened. That risk always exists. And therefore, the organizational question in the civil society organizations has to be that to what extent it's worth taking that risk, and to what extent uh, the risk is not worth taking, or risk is would be avoidable actually. So that has to be discussed in the organization, and probably even beyond the organization. That's one thing that we must talk about. But the other thing that I want to respond to for an earlier question, which is that you see, unlike the business sector, the corporate sector or the business sector, at least in our country, we don't have something of an equivalent of chambers of commerce for the civil society sector. Whereas there are 4 or 5 big chambers of commerce where the fundamental point of these chambers of commerce are that these associations in the business sector do not deal with individual company issues. Individual company issues are dealt by the company themselves, but they deal with larger issues of the sector, of the organizations, of the policies, of the of the rules and regulations and all that. That is a big lack in the country. Bani has been there for long, but the sector has developed much beyond Bani now, but doesn't have. And we need to think very, very clearly of that. Contrast to Bangladesh, where they have very, very good, large sort of associations which can influence government, not about individual organizations' problems or issues, but about the larger sectoral issues. That's one important thing. On the outsourcing, Mani, I invite you to talk about it.
Yeah. So one thing, it is difficult to build these capacities at an individual organization level. I also agree with it, because, and also with the kind of auditors we all have, it's very difficult to deal with it at an individual organization level. But having said that, it's important for us to be just aware of the requirements and what are the important, important complaints regime. To that much. Post that, we can actually form networks of organizations. We can even empanel a set of auditors who are actually, who is a kind of a common resource pool from which we can actually draw from. I have seen certain groups working in that line. Some groups like FMSF and all have been like together, they actually serve some 200 odd organizations in the country in such manner. Those things are, I think, quite possible. Building in an individual organization level may not be really possible, especially for smaller organizations from, with very clear rural grassroots kind of work. It's very difficult to build that capacity within the organization.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah. There are a few more, but yeah, so there are many very specific questions, and I don't think we'll have the time and space to take any further questions already beyond 6. So there are questions like, how do you actually go about doing the smooth transition? What is leadership transition, and what is the organization culture? How is it going to affect? So yeah, I mean, these are, I think, very program specific questions as well. So we have an entire program dedicated to it. We'll be having an information session about the program very soon. So in case you are interested, we'll be sending out an invite. You can join that, which will tell you, broadly what we cover. And in fact, whatever Mani had a lot of questions I can see in the chats, very specific questions about compliances and, these kind of norms. So in fact, his course is completely on legal compliance and financial management in civil sector organization. But for this webinar, I think we'll keep it to this. We can have the other information session as a separate one. Thank you, Ashokda. Thank you, Mani. It was really nice. for me also to get engaged with this. And I think we had quite a nice participation and engagement from the participants as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I
Shanta has
think-
put some dates here. You can pronounce the dates then.
Right. So Shanta is managing the outreach of the diploma program that I mentioned about. So we are going to have an information session on the 24th of May. So you probably get an invite, and if you're interested, you can join. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's more about the program.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Pooja, if I
Shanta,
may
you'd like
add, the quite interesting questions. I was just thinking if they can write to us either at admissions.pgd.id. I think we can collate everything, and anyway, for the registered participants, we are going to send a recording of this webinar. So along with that, I can, meaning because of the time, we are not able to answer, but very interesting questions are there. So we can also try if they want, they write to us and we can share the reply, I think. We'll check with
That's
Ashok
possible.
and
That's certainly possible. Yes.
we'll do that. And of course, yeah, 24th session is there. And I think most of them, we have sent the link for the program, also quite interesting conversation. So those details also we can send it across. That should not be a problem.
In fact, we have many of our current as well as past students, PGDBL students here. I mean, the participants. So it is very nice to see all of them. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.